Our guest today is Jonathan Conricus, a retired lieutenant colonel in the Israeli Defense Forces and former international IDF spokesman, senior fellow at the DC-based think tank, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Over the past year, millions of people have seen Jonathan in some of the most confrontational media environments imaginable. Jonathan, I want to give you the time and space you're almost never given. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, and shalom from Israel.
Jonathan, when you watch your own media appearances over the last 2 years, what do you think the audience is actually witnessing? A debate about Israel's actions or something deeper about how the world now talks about power, morality, and blame?
I think that what I see when I, in order to improve, not because I like doing it, but in order to, see where I needed to answer better, I usually watch my own interviews, especially the ones where I wasn't happy with how the dynamic unfolded. So I watch and I try to learn and improve. And I also actually try to listen to the people that I debate with. And, maybe if I miss something during the debate, a second listen will provide me with an opportunity. And the bottom line would be that my takeaway is that I feel that it isn't really about any of the alleged topics that we're speaking about: human rights, international law, human suffering, right and wrong. That's the window dressing that a lot of people cling on to and claim that they care about. But many of the people who position themselves as champions of human rights, as champions of international law, people that claim to care about human suffering, and when wrongs are being done or perceived wrongs are being done, and they rise up against that in order to defend the oppressed and people that are less fortunate. I've debated many sanctimonious people who claim to be champions of good causes, but what I feel is that most are little more than very small, bitter, and hateful people who care much more about harming Jews and the Jewish state than they actually care about the well-being of Gazans, Lebanese, Iranians, Palestinians in general, Jordanians, Syrians, whatever. And that whenever you try to ask them questions about their real motivation, what really motivates their passion, and why they care so much about 1 out of 200 conflicts that are currently raging in the world, what drives them to be so motivated and so engaged in this specific conflict when there's so much else going on in the world, you never get a good answer. I never get a good answer of why the people who have been out and, crowding American, Canadian, Australian, and European streets with Palestinian flags and allegedly protesting against, that invention of an Israeli genocide, why none of them care about any other disasters around the world where Muslims or Christians are killed and butchered, most of the time by Muslims, and why that doesn't warrant the same level of passion and involvement and engagement and vitriol that we see when it is related to Israel. So my bottom line would be lots and lots of hypocrisy, lots of sanctimonious people who claim to be champions of human rights and higher lofty values. But when you scratch the surface, it really comes down to a lot of sophisticated and dynamic Jew hatred.
At what point did you personally realize that these conversations were no longer about specific policies or events, but about Israel's legitimacy itself?
Yeah, I think, this is something that isn't limited to, the Piers Morgans and other debates that I've participated in and tried to represent an Israeli perspective, but I think it also permeates international established mainstream media, because I think that Israel is held to impossible and unique standards that no other country is held to when it comes to how it conducts war, how it defends itself, and how it protects its civilians and its very sovereignty and existence. And I think that There are a lot of people who still have not come to recognize the fact that Israel exists as the homeland of the Jewish people. They're not comfortable with it. Some are very irritated with it. I'm sure, and I felt this a lot of times, that many of the people that I've had the situation to debate with, and many of the journalists that have asked me very nasty and unprofessional questions, they would rather, I think, that Israel turned up to be that plaque on a wall, like you have in several federal buildings in the US and in many federal locations in Canada and in Australia, where you have this plaque where it says that the Canadian or Australian or whatever government recognizes the original custodians of the land, and then referring to some Native American or Australian or whatever tribe, and thanking them for being the original custodians and that we are now in charge of the land. I think that a lot of people would have wanted and really think that that is the way that the Jewish nation should have ended up, as a little plaque to be placed on a wall in Jerusalem and in Bethel, Bethlehem, Hebron, Nablus, Shechem, and any other place where the Jews should be relegated to history, and they should be a little bit of a footnote that once upon a time, a long time ago in history, the Jews lived here, but now the situation is different, and we acknowledge them as original custodians of the land. Because really, when you zoom out and when you think about how unique Israel is and how amazing our story of return to our homeland, our resurrection at the national level, the revival of our language, the ability to reclaim sovereignty in our ancestral homeland, it's a unique and fascinating story of a indigenous people minority in a very hostile environment that was able to come back to its homeland after 2,000 years of being in exile and to reclaim it. And I'm sure that I feel that there's a lot of people who cannot agree with this and would rather have the Jewish people as a little footnote on a plaque. And I've had this sentiment for a long time, and it goes very deep into the really basic justification and legitimacy of the Jewish people to have a nation state of their own. And I should emphasize that the Jewish nation state is not unique in the sense that it's the only nation state for a people. There are many countries that have a very clear definition of what their culture and religion is. Denmark, a very progressive and advanced and sophisticated and liberal country, states very clearly, Denmark is the country of the Danes. Our culture is the Danish culture, and our religion is Protestant Christianity. That is who we are, and Denmark is the homeland of the Danish people. So I ask, if the Danes can do it, and the Danes are loved by most, they're nice, jovial, great people, considered by most. If the Danes can do it, then why can't Israel? But I think there's tremendous, deep hypocrisy when it comes to Israel, and I felt that many times, where there's this veneer, this outward-facing facade of professional questioning by journalists or media workers, etc. But really, when you go down and ask additional questions, it's difficult not to question the reasoning and the logic behind what many media workers and debaters think, because they really single out Israel and hold us to impossible standards when it comes to how we fight and how we conduct ourselves, our policy, how we defend ourselves. And it's difficult to think of any other reason than what I said before, that there are dark motivations behind it that are not related really to what Israel does or doesn't do.
The word genocide now dominates almost every discussion. Can you walk us through what genocide actually means in international law and why that definition is far more specific than people realize?
Yeah, before that, I think we have to acknowledge that there's an escalation. It's a premeditated and systemic escalation in the use of very severe, historic, and impactful words, usually words that have legal definition and consequences, over the last few years by a system of thinkers and a propaganda system that supports it directed towards Israel. And genocide is one of those terms that was canonized and became part of international legal parlance after the Second World War and after the Holocaust. Yes, it was mentioned before that with regards to the Armenian genocide perpetrated by the Turks in the first 10 years, 10, 15 years of the 20th century. But the genocide with a capital T is, of course, the genocide of the Jewish, or the attempt by the Nazis and their collaborators and helpers to kill and exterminate the Jews in Europe and around the world during the Holocaust and the Second World War. After that, this became a legalized term, part of the code of international law, and it's relatively clearly defined what genocide is. And it's, even though I'm not a legal expert, I'll give you my interpretation of what it means. It is to try to destroy, eliminate an entire group of people where there's a specific intent to do so. And it's not just killing, which is part of war, but it is the intent to actually exterminate a race or people of a certain religion or a certain nationality or group. And, these heavy terms, these loaded terms have been thrown at Israel for quite a long time now. The false allegations of apartheid, which are ridiculous. Anybody who claims that there is apartheid in Israel obviously hasn't spent a single day in an Israeli hospital or on an Israeli train or a bus or on the road or at a gas station or anywhere else in Israel where you see that Israelis of different religious backgrounds, different ethnical backgrounds, share the same public space, have the same legal rights, and that there's absolutely no segregation or separation between people. But nevertheless, this was a strong term that the ecosystem that seeks to undermine Israel's legitimacy started to use, and we saw that in the Durban conference in the early 2000s, where, and of course, that was Durban, South Africa, was chosen for a reason, because that is where real apartheid was practiced. And then the intention was to really delegitimize Israel and try to slander Israel and paint a picture as if Israel is practicing apartheid. That was the first time, about 20 years ago, where we in Israel witnessed a systemic effort that was supported by nation-state actors and an ecosystem of legal and other different types of NGOs with the United Nations and its ecosystem of organizations and programs that really became part of a bigger plan, which really was to use heavily loaded legal terms in order to undermine Israel's very basic legitimacy. And doing so, of course, falsely. So apartheid being one, genocide, which we just spoke about, fake allegations of genocide being leveled against Israel, allegations that have absolutely no proof, are illogical, make no sense. And I'll be blunt and just say something that, I usually don't quote Piers Morgan, but I'll say something that he said quite right when he confronted one of his more crazy guests, one of his anti-Semitic guests, and he asked him, the IDF is a very powerful military. He spoke to his guest, you say that the Israelis are conducting genocide in Gaza. Don't you think that if the Israelis really wanted to kill all the Palestinians, they would have been dead by now? Which I think is a very good, maybe a bit blunt, but a very good question to ask. And I would say yes. If Israel really had such horrible, inhumane intentions, which are so foreign from Israeli thinking and Israeli moral conduct and Israeli and Jewish values, if that was the purpose, I know a lot about Israeli military capabilities, and my opinion is that if that was the purpose, then that would have been achieved. It could have been achieved in a very short matter of time. It definitely wouldn't have taken Israel 2 years, and it would have been over very quickly. But the exact opposite is true, and that's why the whole situation is so absurd, because Israel went to tremendous, great lengths in order to prevent and minimize the effect on non-combatants, basically civilian people in Gaza, and Israel went above and beyond internationally accepted practices of other militaries, the US, UK, France, and any other Western military, in terms of how we conducted our targeting, how we collected intelligence, the procedures that we took, and the precautions that Israel continues to take in order to minimize the effect on non-combatants. And every day that goes by, there's more analysis of those fake numbers that Hamas has been providing, the so-called Hamas health ministry in Gaza. Sadly, their numbers have been used and provided legitimacy by UN institutions and by most countries around the world, which is very regrettable that countries knowingly take numbers that are provided by a terror organization and give them validity. But a deeper analysis, and I would recommend, if any of our listeners still haven't done so, there's a very smart guy on X called Eisenberg, and he's done systemic, continuous, and updated analysis of those Hamas numbers, and he has proven very clearly more than 63% of the casualties in Gaza, as per Hamas numbers, more than 63% are young combat age males. And the whole lies about that the majority of people killed in Gaza out of the alleged 60,100, something like that, are women and children is completely false. And it's part of a same system here and a same effort to try to create a false situation whereby, as if Israel was knowingly and intentionally targeting civilians as part of some sinister intention to kill as many Palestinians as possible. Nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is opposite. Hamas were the ones who were using civilians as their human shields. Hamas were the ones who designed the battle space. They were the ones who designed the combat operations in Gaza. They were the ones who designed the tunnels underneath the civilians. Hamas could have designed their military situation differently. They could have built military bases around the Gaza Strip, but they decided not to do so. They decided to dig underneath the civilian population and hide underneath the civilians, knowing that they put civilians in danger. Hamas decides to fire rockets from within densely populated urban areas. Hamas decides to use hospitals, schools, mosques, UN facilities, anything else that is supposed to be off limits in terms of the international law of warfare. They purposely use these in order to try to use the defense in their advantage. And then when Israel attacks them, which Israel is legally allowed to do, then of course they wait for the international condemnation and they try to use that as international pressure on Israel, which to a certain extent has worked. Bottom line, it hasn't, delivered Hamas any victory, but they've definitely scored international points. So what I would say is that categorically, clearly, from the strategic level down to the tactical level, all that talk, these false allegations against Israel, as if Israel had any genocidal intention towards Gazans, it is false, it is fabricated, and everywhere that you look, where you look at facts, casualty numbers, who the casualties are, how our enemy fights, and what they use in order to fight, when you look at facts, you get a very clear understanding that not only does Israel not have an intention or plan to conduct such a horrible thing, but that Israel's actions are actually opposite of any such horrible claim against Israel.
And just to add to what you're saying, what Hamas did on October 7th, they came in and committed a genocide in Israel. That was clearly an intent to wipe out the Jews, Israelis. How come that is not brought up, by the media?
You make a very valid point, which, when you speak about genocidal intent and anybody that really wants to kill them all, as it goes, you only have to listen to what Hamas seniors have said before the war, during October 7, and after October 7, and they say it very, very honestly and clearly. They say our intention is to kill all of the Jews living in what they call Palestine. They're not, shy about it. They're not hiding. They're saying, we want to kill them all. If we cannot kill them, we will push them out, push them away, but our aspiration is to kill them all. So again, this goes back to the beginning of our conversation about the hypocrisy here and the double standards in terms of how Israel is judged. But yes, this is a genocidal conflict where there's definitely genocidal intentions, but the genocidal intentions are on behalf of Hamas against Israel. And when Israel, unfortunately, sloppily let down its guard, Hamas sought to take advantage of that and kill as many Jews, women, children, babies, elderly, and men as they could. And that's what they did on October 7. And I agree. That in itself should be enough to silence those hypocrites who claim that Israel is the genocidal part, when in reality it is opposite. There's actual evidence, spoken and actions, that are very clear. Hamas's intention on October 7 and onwards, and their intentions still are, they're now lacking in terms of capability, but their intention is to kill all the Jews, to perpetrate genocide against Jews in Israel.
Now, another one of the emotionally powerful accusations is sanctioned starvation. Can you debunk that one for us?
Yeah, I think it's you'll have to do a lot of reading of history and go back a long, long time until you'll be able to find any other example in history of where two sides were fighting and where one side, in legal parlance, these are combatants, right? When two parties of a conflict are fighting and where one side is forced to provide food, fuel, and water to its enemy while they are fighting. Again, I'm not a legal expert, but I've read a lot of military history, and I have not been able to find even one such example where two sides were fighting and one side, in this case Israel, was forced to provide food and water and fuel to its enemy. We have to be clear about something here. Yes, when Israel was forced by the previous U.S. administration, a lot of other external parties and pressure that was applied on Israel, but eventually the screws were tightened by the previous American administration. When Israel was forced to deliver fuel into the Gaza Strip, Israel said clearly to the U.S. administration, we know that the fuel going in will be used by Hamas to conduct military operations and warfare against us. That is how Hamas will run their operations. That is how they will continue to fire rockets at Israeli civilians. A war crime in of itself. And that Hamas will continue to operate and fight against our troops using the very fuel and food that we are now being forced to provide into Gaza. So I think it's an exercise in absurdity. Those months of March, April, May, and June 2024, really absurd situation where Israel, which is fighting for in its own defense, is forced to provide food and fuel and water to its enemy. Now, we'll distinguish here between enemy, Hamas, and the population in Gaza, which isn't an enemy. I wouldn't call them friendly because they support Hamas and they are part of Hamas, but they are not the enemy in the sense that they are eligible military targets. And in accordance with international law, when you control an area where there are civilians in, you as a party to a conflict are obligated to provide that population with the basic necessities of food and medicine and shelter and water, etc. And Israel has done above and beyond that. And again, if you look at facts, I cannot find any other conflict where such a massive amount of international aid has been channeled to one side of the fighting ever since the Second World War. There's been so much suffering in the Middle East, so many wars in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Africa, and in many other places, and I have not seen this level of engagement, this level of fake outcry, and this pressure on one side in the conflict to make sure that the other side, its enemy, is equipped with what it needs in order to continue fighting. If you, for a second, if you erase the word Israel and Gaza and Hamas and Palestinians, and if you would make it in just as an academic exercise and just look at the situation, it is absurd that Israel was attacked by Hamas. Hamas uses the Gazan population as their human shield, and they use their suffering as a tool against Israel. And then when Israel fights back, Israel is then forced eventually to provide food and fuel to its enemy. There's no such example in the world. So what I think here should have been done, what I think would have been a more creative way for Israel to defeat Hamas and to do it much faster with a lower casualty cost for Israel, first and foremost in terms of Israeli soldiers, but also less suffering on the Palestinian side. There are actually two options that would have been relevant in the early stages of the war. One, which by far would have been the best one, would have been to ask the Egyptians, and if asking wasn't enough, then maybe have American pressure applied on the Egyptians to open the gate at Rafah and allow women, children, elderly, and anybody else that isn't part of the fighting, isn't part of Hamas, allow them to escape the war zone and the horrible reality in Gaza, out of a concern for their well-being and safety. That would have been the best and most humane thing to do, to build a humanitarian center in northeastern Sinai with close proximity to the Gaza border, deliver all of the international aid to that area through Egypt, and then once the fighting is over, once Hamas is defeated and all the tunnels are cleared, Israeli hostages returned, and the war is decided and over with an Israeli victory, allow women, children, elderly, and everybody else that left to come back relatively safe, relatively unharmed, relatively in good condition, and to come back and start to rebuild their lives in what's left of the Gaza Strip after Hamas's destruction. That would have been the most humane thing to do. Sadly, the US didn't apply pressure on Egypt to force them to do so. Sadly, Egypt, in its cruelty, prevented Gazans from fleeing a battle zone. Now, since that was reality, what I think Israel should have done differently was to actually build a humanitarian zone outside of the Gaza Strip in Israeli-controlled territory inside Israel, channel all of the aid, food, fuel, medicine, water, shelter, all of those things to an area that Israel controlled, and then tell the civilian population in Gaza, all of the UN bodies and all of the other international NGOs that are part of this giant aid industry in Gaza, tell them that Gaza is now a war zone. There's nothing to look for there. Civilians are going to be outside of that area. They're going to be in this area, let's say the Kerem Shalom area, and we are going to provide everything that they need, all of the humanitarian assistance to this place here. That would, I think, been a second best solution. But the cruelty of the situation here, and again, this is also unique, and I'll challenge the viewers. Tell me another military conflict in modern history where a neighboring country, in this case Egypt, prevented civilians from fleeing a battlefield. That is contrary to international law. According to international law, as adopted after the Second World War, if there are two parties that are fighting and a third party that isn't part of the fighting, if people from one of those sides are trying to flee, the third party is obligated to accept and provide asylum, refugee status for these people. That's exactly the definition of what being a refugee means. Refugee isn't the people that UNRWA take care of that have fourth and fifth generation refugee hereditary status. They are not refugees. They are political tools. But people in Gaza, they actually, by definition, were people who were in a war zone, and they should have been allowed to go out of the Gaza Strip and temporarily be safe in Egypt, but they were prevented very cruelly, very cynically by Egypt, and sadly, up until this day, nobody levels any meaningful criticism against Egypt for their cruelty. And I think are buckets of Palestinian blood, civilian blood, on Egyptian hands in their cruel, very Machiavellian political decision not to allow Gazans out of the Gaza Strip and not to allow them to escape this horrible war zone that Hamas created for them.
Can you go into a little bit more detail on how Hamas benefits strategically from civilian deaths, deprivation, and why is this incentive so rarely discussed in the media?
First, I'll say that they almost succeeded. They came very close to succeeding, and I would say that had it not been for the election of President Trump, their strategy would probably have granted them victory, strategic victory, because their thinking, their strategy before October 7 was that they would do this magnificent military maneuver, go in, kill lots of Israelis, wound lots of Israelis, take Israelis hostage, bring them back into Gaza, and then fight a war of attrition against Israel, using hostages as political leverage against Israel, weakening Israel's resolve to fight, and using the civilian suffering of Palestinians in order to leverage pressure on Israel to stop the fighting, because the civilian population is suffering so much, and that is because of Israel. That's the general strategy. And for the first months, that worked relatively well. Strategic surprise, went into Israel, did the atrocities, the genocidal attacks, and the most brutal, abhorrent acts that have been perpetrated against Israelis since the Holocaust, done by Hamas, gleefully, with pride, filming themselves, mutilating, executing, burning, murdering women, babies, children, and men. And after they did that, they took the hostages, went back into Gaza, hid the hostages in hospitals and in civilian areas and in tunnels, and then they basically waited. And they waited and fought and waited and fought, and they thought that Israel would run out of stamina and will to fight, and that the international pressure that immediately started being focused on Israel would be enough to actually cause Israel to fold, and for them, Hamas, to be able to dictate the terms of the future, while having Israeli hostages, which was an amazing political leverage against Israel, and without having been defeated by Israel. And had it not been for the election of President Trump, I think they would have succeeded. And Israel would have been forced to agree to basically capitulate to Hamas. And I'm very happy that that didn't happen. I'm very proud of Israeli soldiers, of the defense establishment, and I think some credit is, of course, due also to the government for making right decisions and staying the course. And I think we should be very grateful for the fact that President Trump and his team from day one had a very clear policy: get the hostages home, and that Hamas cannot have any role to play in the future of Gaza. So this strategy that Hamas has used cynically for many years was really put on steroids, and they tried to execute it at a larger level. I think they came close to succeeding. Luckily, they didn't. And I think that there are a lot of lessons here for other democracies fighting for their survival, fighting to defend their own people, where we have to understand that the current strategic atmosphere and the current strategic boundaries, they actually favor the terror organizations and not the democracies, not the countries that are defending themselves and defending their civilian population, but the legal framework actually makes it very difficult for democracies to fight and much easier for terror organizations to use the system against a country like Israel. So it's an absurd situation. Hamas are extremely cynical, extremely cruel to their own people that they claim to represent. But what makes it even more astonishing is that even though this has happened, and even though the civilian population in Gaza has suffered tremendously as a result of Hamas's strategy and actions, there are still around 40% of the population in Gaza today that supports Hamas. And that, for me, defies logic. Hamas brought about the destruction of the Gaza Strip, of almost all of the infrastructure there. They brought about lots of casualties and wounded and suffering and humiliation for people in Gaza. when they started a war against Israel. Yet despite that, more than 2 years after, almost half of the population in Gaza still supports Hamas. And that is something that I think people aren't aware of and should be aware of, because that really tells you where ultimately hearts and minds are.
Let's address one of the other issues that the media brings up. Piers Morgan, I hear him say this all the time. Why are journalists restricted from coming into Gaza? Is this a deeper fear of operational security, or is it a loss of narrative control? If you can address that.
Yeah, I would have wanted this to be different when I was in the IDF as a spokesperson, and afterwards I continued to say and advise that I think it would be wiser on Israel's part to allow international media into the Gaza Strip at their own risk and peril, to try to coordinate and facilitate their access out of many reasons. One, this is what democracies do when they fight. First, there are embeds, and then when the situation allows, international media is usually allowed to do its work. I believe in free access to, or in unlimited access of the media to a battlefield. I think that's important. I don't think that Israel has anything to hide in terms of how it conducts itself and how it operates. And I think that there's been a misunderstanding, a miscalculation in Israel, which was along the logic of, the international media in general is very biased against Israel. And if they're given access, then they will be on the ground and they will strengthen the Hamas narrative and wrongfully portray the situation, which, if we're honest, is more or less what they've been doing anyhow. And at this day and age, where almost everyone has a cell phone, then images will come out of any battlefield. And what this policy that Israel enacted, the results are really that the only narrative that came out of the Gaza Strip was a narrative that was controlled by Hamas. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's a strategic mistake, and I said it to Piers, and I've said it to many other people. I've said it inside the IDF and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and others, that Israel should have allowed that a long time ago, without expecting that, Israel would get favorable coverage from the BBC or Sky or the New York Times. No, that probably won't happen until all of those organizations are reformed, most of the editors fired, and most of the staff replaced with true professionals who don't have an institutional bias against Israel. But nevertheless, even though that is the situation, I think that Israel would have been smarter to allow media in, because the way that the conflict has been reflected is very negative anyhow. And by Israel not allowing media in has been, I think, more detrimental to Israel's power of persuasion than actually allowing international media in.
Let's speak a little bit about Qatar. We see that Qatar, on the one hand, is sheltering Hamas leaders, funding Hamas, head of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al Jazeera. And then on the other hand, they're the mediators with Israel, and, they're doing business with America, sending money to different institutions in America and different, people in the media. What do you assess about Qatar?
Yes, Qatar is a nefarious state sponsor of terrorism, is a tiny, puny country with tremendous wealth, but with a very, I think, realistic fear that they are small, surrounded, and incapable of defending themselves against external aggression by themselves, and therefore the Qataris, using their tremendous outworldly wealth from mostly natural resources, oil and gas, have launched many very successful influence campaigns around the world in order to hedge themselves and to elevate their national standing. Everything that you said, I agree. Qatar supports Hamas. They have been housing Hamas officials and operatives for a very long time. They have been providing them with money and financial support. The Qatari state owns Al Jazeera and directs it. And Al Jazeera, in my mind, is the biggest proponent and catalyst of Islamist jihadi violence in the world. I think it is an organization that masquerades as media, but really is a mouthpiece for the Muslim Brotherhood, and it is a promoter of radical Islamist views. It is an enemy of the West. It is an enemy of moderate Arab Muslim countries, and it is a threat. And it is a very effective tool that is built by, used by, and directed by the Qatari government. Unfortunately, without any consequences still. Now, I think that what is the most troubling, I have to say, in the last few days, there's been new revelations in Israeli media about alleged Qatari influence even in Israel. You spoke about the US, and we can speak about the UK, France, many other countries where the Qataris have done what they do best: by influence, by people, by media organizations, by centers of education, universities, cultural institutes. That's what the Qataris do. They use money in order to get favorable coverage or favorable treatment. But what we've seen in the last days, more events are coming to light that cast very serious, or they generate very serious questions about how successful the Qataris actually were with getting influence in Israel, in the most elite and sensitive location, the Prime Minister's office. And sadly, I, as an Israeli civilian, have a lot of questions that I would want to get answered by the Prime Minister himself, by his senior people, by a lot of the people who are in the Prime Minister's office, because a lot of things don't add up when it comes to the alleged level of access and influence that Qatar had in Israel. And that is how Qatar operates. Still, this is still being investigated, and there's a legal process. So, of course, we'll have to wait for the legal process to go through the motions and for things to become public knowledge and verified. But as we stand now, lots of questions that need to be asked. In my mind, Qatar is a state sponsor of terrorism that should be condemned, should be ostracized, should be shunned by the world, and should definitely not have the type of standing that it has today. I usually don't criticize the US government, but I think US policy towards Qatar is a giant mistake. I think providing the Qataris with a almost at the level of defense treaty between the US and Qatar is a very bad thing to do. Qatar is not a benign, positive actor in any sense. The Qataris support terrorism, they support radical Islam, and I am disappointed to see that they are getting support from the US government.
Let's shift to Iran. Do you think that Iran is still a threat to the West, to Israel, even after the 12-day war? There are reports that they try to recruit spies in Israel. Can you just address,
Yeah, the absurdity of the situation here is really quite immense. The Iranian economy is tanking. Their currency continues to break records of devaluation. As we speak, it's almost 1.4 million Iranian rial for $1, which is the lowest it's ever been since 19 Islamic Revolution, when Islamists took over control over Iran. And Iranian economy is suffering. Iranian civilians are suffering. They are facing water shortages and electric shortages and lots of instability in the country. And it's clearly a country that is mired by very bad governance, corruption, and a very poor sense of priorities and definition of priorities. And in that case, for me, it's mind-boggling that the Iranian regime, their statements and outwardly actions and what you hear their leaders speak about, they are still on and on about what they call the Zionist entity. Their own country is going under in terms of water, electricity, provision of services to people, inflation and currency, serious internal issues to deal with. And instead of doing that, the Islamic Republic of Iran continues with its fixation, its, I would say, really sick fixation with the state of Israel. And as we're speaking, even after the 12 days of war between Israel, the US, and Iran, the Iranians are still trying to revive their nuclear weapons program. They are making serious efforts to rebuild their missile production facilities and to restore the assembly lines and many other things that Israel and the US, but mostly Israel, struck in those 12 days of war. And they're saying very clearly, we are committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. Just a day ago, new posters were hung in a main square in Tehran called Palestine Square, where they are openly threatening, the Iranian government is openly threatening, and this time they're speaking about, we will turn your nights into days and as we launch war against you. That's what they have written in Hebrew and in Farsi on a giant poster in a square in the middle of Tehran. Now, that to me, it defies logic. And you asked, are they a threat? Yes, definitely. As long as that regime governs Iran, Iran will be a threat towards Israel. Now it's a lesser threat than what it was on October the 7th, 2023, because much of what they tried to establish around Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Syria, and other things have been undone by Israel very effectively, by the IDF, by Mossad, etc. But as long as that regime exists, they will be a threat to Israel. Therefore, what I think Israel should be focusing on is to undermine that regime and to create the conditions for that regime to be overthrown. And I think the sooner that happens, the better for the Iranian people, the better for the region, and the better for Israel. That is, of course, not something that Israel can do on its own. Israel can help, Israel can try to facilitate, but Israel doesn't have the capacity to conduct regime change anywhere. We can barely run our own political system. But in terms of Iran, I think that should be an objective. And I think it's a defensive objective because that regime has an outspoken strategic goal to annihilate the state of Israel. And as long as they exist, they will pose a threat towards Israel. If they won't be able to do it directly, with ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, they will continue to do it indirectly with terror organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and others that they will try to use as proxies, and we will have to continue to fight them. So the sooner that regime is toppled, the better for the region, the better for the Iranian people.
We saw what happened, unfortunately, in Australia on Bondi Beach, the effects of radical Islamic terrorism. Do you think that Western governments are afraid to confront this reality? What do you think that they need to do to get rid of this, if they could?
Yeah, of course they could, but it would be difficult and it would require leadership, courage, and clarity from a lot of elected officials in Western countries. Canada comes first to mind, but Belgium, the UK, Germany, France, many other countries, and of course Australia, as you mentioned, have serious problems of misunderstanding or underestimating the potency of the Islamist threat that is festering in their own countries. And you and I will probably care most about what this means for Jews. And maybe most people watching will look at it from a perspective of the safety of the Jewish population in that country, which is first and foremost what it is. It is currently focused on killing Jews. And we've seen that manifested politically, and we've seen it manifested violently on many streets, and we've seen it all over the world. And I'll remind everybody watching, it wasn't as a result of Israeli actions. Most of these manifestations, protests, riots, demonstrations started on October 8th, and there were celebrations of the success of Hamas against Israel. They were not protests against what Israel hadn't yet done, but there were more manifestations of support for Hamas and what the Palestinians had done against the Jews in Israel. And I think that the biggest problem here is lack of courage and leadership. There are so many countries that are led by politicians who knowingly are undermining the future of their own countries by appeasing a population that espouses Jew hatred, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, which, by the way, for me is just the same thing. And they are doing so just to get elected and just for the electoral purposes of it. But what they're also doing, aside from betraying their Jewish population, whether it's in Canada, in Australia, in some places in the US, in the UK, etc., they're really exposing their law-abiding, proud Jewish patriots of whatever country we're speaking about, exposing them to Islamists and violence and threats, and forcing them to live under fear and to have armored guards to protect their children going to school and many other things. They're doing that. But what they're also doing, which is even worse long-term for their countries, is that they're basically allowing cancerous thoughts and institutions to take hold of parts of their country. I've written about this just recently in the Jerusalem Post, where I speak about the main threat to Western civilization, which is radical Islamism and its quest to take over the societies where Muslims have been accepted in. And that's most of the West. And this is what the Muslim Brotherhood is about. And again, where it bleeds and where it really flashes and meets the media is when Islamists inspired by ISIS, radicalized through watching Al Jazeera or online content, then take action and actually butcher and murder Jews. And then people become a little bit more aware of it. But this is a far wider phenomena, and I think it's very dangerous for Jews. It's very dangerous for the West. And in history, we've seen this so many times that it never ends with the Jews. It starts with the Jews, and the Jews are many times the first to suffer from radical ideologies, but it usually doesn't stop with them. And usually societies that allow this type of hatred and radicalism to exist, they usually suffer themselves in the long run. That's what happened to Germany. That's what happened to Italy. That's what happened in Japan. And that's what happened to, in many cases, in Russia and many other undemocratic societies that allowed this type of hatred to start. And in many cases in history, the Jews were the first, but they weren't the last sacrifices.
I'd like to ask you the last question. What does Israel need to do differently? Not to win debates, but to survive years to come? What's your final message for our audience?
Let's first acknowledge the tremendously positive situation that Israel is in. And I'm not naive, okay? I wake up and I smell the hummus every day, and I recognize the fact that there are many challenges that remain in Israel and around Israel. My perspective is, of course, influenced a lot by my previous military service, so I look at things from many times through a military lens. But when I look at our situation, I am extremely proud of what we've accomplished so far, previous generations and this generation, and I think that we are very fortunate. I think that what we have today in Israel is a very strong country that has a solid economic foundation, where there's a strong and vibrant civilian population and civil society, yes, with political differences and diverse, but with the capacity to rally around the national cause, fight effectively, with the willingness to endure hardship, and with the brilliance and stamina to overcome our enemies. And if you look at Israel today, and if you look at Israel through the lens of economic Israel today, as defined by The Economist, which isn't usually very Israel-friendly in how it reflects on the country, The Economist ranks Israel as the third fastest growing economy in the last years. And that's quite an astonishing achievement. And I think it's a testament to how strong Israel really is, despite everything happening. And I am very, very optimistic about the future, because I try to remain in touch with young people and listen to what young people say and feel and do. And when I interact with young people, they are very hopeful. They're not naive, and they're not singing, peace and love and kumbaya, and they're not thinking about going to Woodstock. They understand that we're still in the woods, not out of the woods yet by any stretch of the imagination. But what they say is, fine, we'll fight. This is our country. This is our ancestral homeland. This is where we belong. And we and previous generations have worked so hard to make this country flourish, to make the land flourish, and to create a vibrant democracy in this area of the world which isn't blessed with a lot of democracies at all. And Israel is a great example of a indigenous population expelled that was able to return home and rebuild its nation. So what I think Israel should be doing is to continue to work hard, outthink, outwork, and outfight our enemies. That's the basic necessity. What we need to do is to listen to our enemies. We failed to do that before October 7. We have to listen to our enemies and listen to what they really say. And when they say that they want to destroy the state of Israel and kill all the Jews, take them at their word and understand that this is really what they're trying to do, and take action in order to prevent them from having the capacity to do so. Make sure that people who say these things and have these thoughts do not have the tools to enact what they wish would happen against Israel. And that goes everywhere. That goes relevant to Iran, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to Syria. Wherever there is an enemy that has that kind of intentions towards Israel, Israel needs to take preemptive action, like in the good old days of 67 and before, where we didn't wait for things to happen, and we took preemptive action because it was militarily necessary for us to do so. And I think that that kind of thought has changed, and we have, I think, corrected a lot of the malign thinking, naive, malign Western thinking that was very pervasive in Israel pre-October 7, and that needs to stay the course. Number 5, we need to continue to try to find a peaceful solution to the conflict with the Palestinians. I believe that it is our interest to, as soon as possible, create a political distinction and separation between Israel and Palestinians. I do not want them as equal citizens in Israel, and I do not want to govern them as an occupying military force. And I think it is within our interest to create that distinction. The sooner and the clearer we do it, the better for us. And I think that should be a natural goal. We should continue to aspire to expand the amazing Abraham Accords, to extend a hand, an industrious hand of accomplishment and creativity and peace towards our neighbors, close and far away. And we should continue to leverage our amazing tech, agricultural, medical, cyber, and all of the other branches of Israeli economy in order to create alliances and improve our diplomatic situation. I think we have to invest much more in diplomacy and soft power. We have a lot of hard power, military, but we need more soft power. We need better diplomatic skills. We need more soft capabilities to deliver a message, to fight the battle of the narratives, to confront fake news and slanders against Israel. And I think we have to invest much more in that realm, and Israel hasn't done enough in that sense yet. And we have to continue to educate our people, our young, to be proud, Zionist, patriotic, to believe in our sense and the justification for us to live in our ancestral homeland, and again, to feel how fortunate we are to live in the land that our forefathers were killed trying to defend and were expelled from many generations ago. And now we're back, and it is in our lifetime that we can help make this place even better, greener, cleaner, safer, better, more prosperous, more advanced, more progressive in the true sense of it, more equal and egalitarian, and all of the things that already exist in Israel that we've already done. So my message is one of unity. I would like to thank, I'm sure there's lots of people who will watch this from outside of Israel, in the US, in Canada, Australia, Europe, many other places, and I would like to thank people. I know that there's been such an amazing outpouring of love and support from the Jewish diaspora towards Israel, and I think that what we really should also be doing is to strengthen those bonds and mend and fix bridges that I think were damaged over the years between the Jews who live in Israel and the Jews who live outside of Israel. And I've seen lots of positive things happen. So I would like to say thank you for the generosity, the thoughts, the prayers, the involvement, the care, and all of the amazing things that American, Canadian, Australian, South African, English, French, all of the Jews around the world have done. It's miraculous in itself. And my message is one of we will continue to fight, to prosper, and to nourish our homeland, and we are not going anywhere.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, thank you so much for your time and for your incredible insights. I learned so much in this hour. I want to thank you for everything that you do for the state of Israel, for the Jewish people, and just keep going stronger and stronger. You may have a lot of success, continued success for you and all your loved ones. Thank you again for everything.
Thank you. A pleasure to thank you for having me on. And of course, shalom from Israel.